Margaret Eleanor Whitfield had everything the world said a person should want. She was 51 years old, and before the accident, she had been the kind of woman who walked into rooms and made people stop talking. Not because she was loud, not because she demanded attention, but because there was something about her, the way she carried herself, the sharp blue eyes that missed nothing, the quiet confidence of someone who had built a billion-dollar pharmaceutical company from a single rented office in downtown Chicago, that made people lean forward without knowing why. She had been on her way to a board meeting on a Tuesday morning in November when the other driver ran the red light. The impact was clean and terrible and fast. Margaret remembered the sound of glass. She remembered the white ceiling of an ambulance. She remembered a paramedic's voice saying her name over and over as if repetition could hold her in place. And then she remembered waking up in a hospital room with her daughter sitting by the window and a doctor standing at the foot of her bed with the kind of careful face that people make when they are about to change your life forever. The injury was to her cervical spine. The damage was permanent. From the chest down, Margaret Whitfield, the woman who had once run marathons, who had once danced at her daughter's wedding until the band stopped playing, who had once stood at the top of a mountain in New Zealand just because she wanted to know what it felt like, would not move again. She spent 8 months in rehabilitation. She was determined in the way she had always been determined, with her jaw set and her eyes fixed forward and a kind of cold fury burning behind her ribs. She learned to use a motorized wheelchair. She learned to ask for help with things that had once been as thoughtless as breathing. She learned that the world was not built for people like her, that doorways were too narrow and sidewalks were cracked, and people looked at her now with a particular mixture of pity and discomfort that made her feel like a problem rather than a person. Her company did not wait for her. The board, made up largely of men she had hired herself, men she had mentored and defended and promoted through years of difficult decisions, voted to install an interim CO within 4 months of her accident. They called it temporary. They used words like stability and continuity and the company's best interests. Margaret listened to the call on speakerphone from her hospital bed and said nothing. She had learned, in those months, that silence was sometimes the only dignified response to betrayal. Her second husband left 14 months after the accident. He did not do it cruelly. He sat across from her in the living room of the home they had shared for 6 years and told her that he loved her, but that he had not expected this, that he was not strong enough for this, that he hoped she could understand. Margaret looked at him for a long time. Then she told him she did understand. She did not cry until he was gone. Then she cried for a long time, alone, in the way that people cry when they are finally honest with themselves about how much something has cost them. Her friends came less often. This was not a single event, but a slow erosion, like a shoreline losing ground to water. First, the invitations stopped coming. Dinner parties and charity galas and weekend trips to Lake Geneva, because the venues were not accessible, because the logistics were complicated, because it was easier not to try. Then the phone calls grew shorter. Then there were weeks of silence that became months of silence, and Margaret began to understand that some people had not been her friends at all, but had simply been the friends of her power, her access, her usefulness. Her daughter, Claire, was the exception. Claire drove from Indianapolis every other weekend and sat with her mother and watched movies and argued about politics and brought food from the restaurant Margaret had loved for 30 years. Claire was 31 years old and fiercely loyal and sometimes too honest, but her honesty was the honest of love, and Margaret trusted it. It was Claire who, in the spring of the following year, convinced Margaret to move to a smaller city. "You're disappearing in that house," Claire said. "You're sitting in 12,000 square feet and talking to no one." Margaret had not argued. She had looked around the house that had once felt like an achievement and understood that it had become a kind of beautiful prison. She sold it. She bought a modest condominium in Millbrook, a mid-sized city in Wisconsin that neither of them had ever paid much attention to, a place with wide sidewalks and a small arts community and a farmer's market on Saturday mornings. She told herself it was a practical decision. She was not yet able to admit that what she was really doing was trying to become a different version of herself, quieter, smaller, closer to something real. Millbrook was not the world Margaret had lived in before. It was a city of school teachers and nurses and factory workers and retirees. People smiled at her on the sidewalk. The coffee shop near her building learned her order. The woman who ran the farmer's market saved her a bunch of lavender every week because Margaret had once mentioned she liked the smell. These were small things. But Margaret, who had once measured her life in board meetings and quarterly earnings and the price of her company's stock, was beginning to understand that small things were not actually small at all. She had been in Millbrook for 5 months when she first heard about the community dance event at the Millbrook Cultural Center. She had no intention of going. It was not that she was opposed to it in any principled way. It was simply that the idea of going to a dance, in a wheelchair, alone, in a room full of strangers, felt like asking herself to be brave in a way that she was not sure she could manage. She had been brave about so many things in the past 2 years. She had been brave about the rehabilitation and brave about the boardroom and brave about her husband's leaving and brave about the slow disappearance of her social world. She was tired of being brave. Sometimes she thought that the constant demand for bravery was its own kind of cruelty, that the world expected disabled people to be perpetually courageous, as if simply existing in a body that worked differently was an achievement that required celebration. But Claire called on a Thursday night and told her she was going. "I'm not asking," Claire said. "I already bought a ticket. I'm coming up Saturday, and we're going." Margaret had said fine in the tone she used when she had already decided to lose an argument. The Millbrook Cultural Center was a converted warehouse on the east side of downtown. It was not elegant in the way that the venues Margaret had spent her life attending were elegant. There was no marble, no chandeliers, no waitstaff moving silently through rooms arranged to impress. But it was warm and well lit, and the floors were smooth, and the doorways were wide. And someone had strung lights along the ceiling that made the whole space feel like something out of a memory she couldn't quite place. There were perhaps 200 people there. A live band played in the corner. A 6-piece group that moved easily between jazz and blues and something that Margaret didn't have a name for, but that sat comfortably in her chest. People danced in the center of the room. Some of them were good, and some of them were not, and none of them seemed to care which they were. And Margaret sat near the edge of the room and watched and felt something she had not expected to feel. She felt the faint, tentative, dangerous beginning of something like wanting. She did not act on it. She sat with her sparkling water and watched the dancers and talked with Claire and told herself that watching was enough, that presence was enough, that she had done the brave thing just by being there. And she had. But wanting is not a thing that stays quiet once it has been named, and Margaret Whitfield, despite everything the last 2 years had taken from her, had never in her life been very good at wanting something and not reaching for it. She just didn't know yet that something, or someone, was about to reach for her first. Marcus Devereux had not planned to be at the Millbrook Cultural Center that Saturday night either. He had planned to be at home, on his couch, watching whatever game was on and eating the leftover jerk chicken his mother had sent home with him the previous Sunday in the large plastic container she always used, the one with the cracked lid that he kept meaning to replace and never did. He had planned a quiet night, the kind of night that single fathers of 10-year-old boys learn to treasure, because quiet is not a thing that happens often or for very long, and when it does, a man learns not to waste it. But his daughter had asked him to come. Not his son, his daughter. Amara was 14 years old, and she danced with the youth performance group that was showcasing at the Cultural Center that evening. She had been rehearsing for 6 weeks, and she had mentioned the event every day for the last 2 of those weeks, not in the way of demanding, but in the careful, hopeful way of a teenager who wants something from a parent and is not sure how to ask directly. Marcus had noticed. He always noticed with Amara. She was quieter than her brother, deeper in the way she processed the world, and he had learned years ago that the things she didn't say directly were often the things that mattered most. So he had put on a clean shirt and pressed his good trousers and driven to the Cultural Center with Amara sitting beside him in the passenger seat, her hair done in the elaborate braided style his mother had helped with the night before, her hands folded in her lap with the studied calm of someone managing nerves. "You're going to be great," he had told her. "You don't know that," she had said. "No," he had agreed. "But I know you. And that's close enough." She had looked out the window and said nothing, but the corner of her mouth had moved in a way that meant she was holding back a smile, and Marcus had counted that as a win. Amara performed in the first set, 20 minutes of choreography that the youth group had been building since January. Marcus stood near the back of the room because he was tall. 6'3" and broad in the shoulders, in the way of a man who had spent his 20s doing physical work and his 30s learning to live in a body that age was beginning to negotiate with. And he did not want to block anyone's view. He watched his daughter move and felt the particular pride of a parent watching a child do something they love, a pride that had nothing to do with perfection and everything to do with presence, with the simple fact that this person he was responsible for had found a thing that lit her up from the inside. After the performance, Amara went backstage with her group and told her father she would be at least an hour, maybe more, and that he should stay and enjoy himself. She said this in the slightly authoritative tone she had begun using in the past year, the tone that told Marcus she was practicing being the person she intended to become, and he had smiled and told her he would find something to do. He had gotten himself a drink from the bar, sparkling water, because he was driving, and moved to the edge of the room where the light was softer and the music was easier to hear without the noise of conversation competing with it. He liked this band. They were playing something that reminded him of the records his grandfather used to keep in a wooden crate beside the record player in the back room of his house in Baton Rouge, old jazz albums with covers that were soft from handling, music that smelled like another era. When Marcus closed his eyes and listened hard enough, he was listening like that, with his eyes half closed and his weight shifted to one side, when he noticed the woman in the wheelchair. She was sitting perhaps 15 feet away, near the edge of the dance floor, and she was watching the dancers with an expression that Marcus could not immediately name. It was not sadness, exactly, though there was something in it that lived near sadness. It was not longing, though that was closer. It was the expression of someone watching something they love from a place they are not sure they are allowed to enter, and Marcus recognized it because he had worn that expression himself in the years after his marriage ended, standing at the edges of things he didn't know how to walk back into. She was with a younger woman who looked enough like her to be a daughter. The two of them were talking, but the older woman's attention kept drifting back to the dancers, and each time it did, something moved across her face that she seemed to be trying to keep still. Marcus watched her for a while. He was not a man who acted without thinking, and what he was thinking now was layered and careful. He thought about what it would mean to approach a woman in a wheelchair and ask her to dance, whether it would feel to her like an offering or like an intrusion, whether it would land as kindness or as the particular kind of pity that people in wheelchairs likely spent their whole lives navigating and resenting. He thought about whether he was the right person to ask, whether a stranger had any business making that kind of gesture, whether the right thing was simply to leave her to her evening. But he kept coming back to that expression on her face. He had 3 children. 2 were his by birth, Amara and his son, Jalen, who was 10 and loud and relentlessly curious and currently at his grandmother's house for the weekend. 1 was his by love and years and choice, a young man named Derek who had been Marcus's best friend's son and who had come to live with Marcus at 15 after his father died, and who was now 22 and in college in Milwaukee and called Marcus every Sunday without fail. Marcus had not planned any of it. The children had not arrived according to a plan. They had arrived because he had been present and willing, and because, at the moments that mattered, he had decided that showing up was more important than knowing exactly what to do. He made that decision again now. He set down his glass. He straightened his shirt. He walked the 15 feet across the floor with the measured, unhurried stride of a man who had decided something and was not going to second-guess it. And when he reached the woman, he stopped in front of her at a respectful distance, close enough to speak without raising his voice, far enough that she did not have to feel crowded, and he smiled. "Excuse me," he said. "I don't mean to interrupt. My name is Marcus. I've been watching you watch the dancers for about 20 minutes, and I was wondering if you'd like to join them." The woman looked at him. Her eyes were very blue and very direct, and Marcus had the immediate sense that she was a person who was used to seeing through things, through presentations, through performances, through the versions of themselves that people showed to the world. He met her gaze and did not look away, because he had nothing to hide, and because he suspected she would know it immediately if he did. "I'm in a wheelchair," she said. Her voice was dry and precise, with the faint edge of someone testing whether he had noticed the obvious or intended to pretend otherwise. "I can see that," Marcus said. "I'm asking anyway." Something shifted in her face. It was small and fast, and she controlled it quickly, but Marcus caught it. A flicker of something that was almost surprise, almost amusement, and underneath both of those things, something much older, and much more careful that he didn't have a name for yet. The younger woman beside her, the daughter, made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a word. "My name is Margaret," the woman in the wheelchair said. "Nice to meet you, Margaret," Marcus said. He extended his hand. She took it. Her grip was firm and immediate, the handshake of someone who had spent decades in rooms where being taken seriously required announcing it before anyone had the chance to decide otherwise. "I don't know how this works," she said. Her voice was still careful, but there was something underneath the carefulness now that had not been there before, something that was paying attention. "Neither do I," Marcus said honestly. "But the band is good and the floor is smooth, and I think we can figure it out as we go." Margaret Whitfield looked at him for a long moment. Behind her, her daughter was very still in the way of someone trying not to influence an outcome they desperately want. Then Margaret looked back at the dance floor. The band had shifted into something slower, a deep, rolling blues that moved through the room like warm water, and the couples on the floor had drawn closer together, moving with the easy intimacy of people who had stopped thinking and started feeling. "All right," Margaret said. The word was quiet, but it was not uncertain. Marcus stepped beside her chair. He did not grab the handles or take control. He simply walked next to her as she guided herself forward, and together they moved to the edge of the dance floor. And when they reached it, he turned to face her and opened his hands in the unhurried, patient way of a man who understood that the best things in life were worth waiting to begin. And Margaret, for the first time in 2 years and 4 months, moved towards something she wanted. What happened on that dance floor was not graceful in the way that movies show dancing to be graceful. There was no choreography. There was no perfectly timed dip or elegant spin. There was no moment where the crowd parted and the light fell on them in exactly the right way, and everyone stopped to watch with their hands over their hearts. Real life does not work like that, and both Margaret Whitfield and Marcus Devereux were people who had lived enough of real life to know the difference between what things look like and what they actually are. What happened was simpler and more important than any of that. Marcus stood beside her wheelchair and moved slowly to the music, and Margaret moved her arms and her upper body the way the music asked her to. And they found a rhythm together the way two people find rhythm when they are both genuinely listening. Not performing, not trying, just listening. The band played and the lights above them were warm and golden, and the room kept moving around them the way rooms do, full of other people living their own evenings. And for a few minutes neither of them spoke. Marcus had one hand extended, and Margaret held it. Not tightly, not in the way of someone holding on for safety. In the way of someone who had decided to be connected to another person and was doing so deliberately, with full awareness of what they were choosing. "You're not bad at this," Margaret said. "My mother made me take lessons when I was 9, Marcus said. "I was furious about it at the time. And now I understand that most of the things I was furious about at 9 were actually gifts." Margaret was quiet for a moment. The music moved around them. "How old are you?" she asked. It was the question of someone who had decided to be direct rather than polite, and Marcus appreciated it. 43, he said. "I'm 53, Margaret said. It was not a confession, but it was not entirely neutral either. It was information she was offering to see what he did with it. "All right," Marcus said simply, in the same tone he might use to acknowledge that the weather was mild or the room was warm, a tone that assigned the fact exactly as much weight as it deserved, which was very little. Margaret looked at him. "You're not going to make something of that." "Why would I?" She didn't have an answer for that. Or rather, she had an answer. She had several answers, drawn from 2 years of watching people make something of everything about her. Her age and her wheelchair and her money and her gender, and the way all of those things combined into a version of her that other people seemed to find complicated and inconvenient. But none of those answers applied to Marcus, who was looking at her with the calm, unhurried attention of a man who had asked a simple question and was genuinely waiting for whatever came next. Claire found them 20 minutes later. She had gone to get drinks and come back to find her mother's seat empty. And for one terrible second, she had felt the familiar lurch of panic before she saw Margaret at the edge of the dance floor. And then the panic had shifted into something else entirely, something that sat in Claire's chest like the first warm day after a long winter. She stood at the side of the room and watched, and did not interrupt. When the song ended and Marcus walked with Margaret back toward their original spot, Claire was there waiting, and she did a very poor job of pretending she had not been watching the whole time. Margaret introduced them with the faintly amused expression of a woman who understood exactly what her daughter was thinking and was choosing not to comment on it. Marcus shook Claire's hand. Claire shook his with the firm, evaluating grip of a daughter who loved her mother and was not going to pretend otherwise. Some silent communication passed between them in that handshake, the kind that doesn't need words because the words are unnecessary, because both people already understand what is being said. Amara appeared at Marcus's elbow shortly after, still flushed and bright from the performance, wearing the particular luminous expression of a teenager who has just done something they are proud of and is trying not to show exactly how proud. Marcus introduced her to Margaret and Claire, and Amara shook Margaret's hand with the careful, slightly formal politeness of a well-raised child meeting an adult for the first time. "Your father says you performed tonight," Margaret said to her. "Yes, ma'am," Amara said. "Were you nervous?" Amara considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "At the beginning," she said. "And then the music started, and I forgot to be nervous." Margaret nodded slowly, as if this answer meant more to her than Amara could have known. "That's the best thing about music," she said quietly. "It has a way of making you forget the things that were stopping you." Amara looked at her for a moment, and then looked at her father, and then looked back at Margaret with the perceptive, uncanny gaze of a teenager who understood more about the world than adults generally gave her credit for. She said nothing, but she smiled. A real smile, not the polite one, and Margaret felt something in her chest shift in a way that was not painful, but was not entirely comfortable either, the shifting of something that had been very still for a very long time. The four of them sat together for the remainder of the evening. The conversation moved the way good conversation moves, not in a straight line, but in circles and tangents, doubling back on itself, discovering unexpected connections in unexpected places. Marcus had grown up in Baton Rouge and moved to Milwaukee at 26, and then to Millbrook 11 years ago for reasons that had made sense at the time and had turned out to be the right decision for reasons he hadn't anticipated. Margaret had grown up in Cincinnati and spent 30 years in Chicago and moved to Millbrook 5 months ago for reasons she was still in the process of understanding. They had both lost people. They had both rebuilt things. They had both arrived at their middle years with a clearer sense of what mattered and a lower tolerance for the things that didn't. Before the evening ended, Marcus asked Margaret if he could have her number. He asked it plainly, without the awkward performance of casualness that people sometimes use to protect themselves from the exposure of wanting something. He just asked. Margaret looked at him for a moment with those blue eyes that missed nothing, and then she gave it to him, and she noticed that her hand was not entirely steady when she typed it into his phone, and she noticed that she did not particularly mind that he might notice that too. He called the following Tuesday. Not a text. A call. Margaret had not expected a call. Most people didn't call anymore. They sent short messages that could be answered at a safe distance. And when she saw his name on her phone screen, she sat with it for one full ring before she answered. Not because she was uncertain, but because she wanted one moment to be still with the fact that something was beginning. And she knew from experience that beginnings don't always announce themselves. And when they do, they deserve a second of quiet attention before the noise of living takes over. They talked for 2 hours. About his children and her company and the years in between the person you plan to be and the person you actually become. About Millbrook and what it meant to choose a smaller life not as a defeat, but as a kind of honesty. About his grandfather's jazz records and her daughter's stubbornness and the particular freedom of being past the age of pretending. He asked her to have coffee the following Saturday. She said yes. The coffee became a habit. Saturday mornings at the coffee shop near her building, which learned Marcus's order the same way it had learned Margaret's, quickly and without fuss, the way places do when someone becomes a regular, when someone has decided to stay. They talked about everything and they talked about nothing, and they sat in comfortable silence when the silence came, which is its own kind of intimacy, the intimacy of not needing to fill every space. Margaret did not fall in love quickly. She was not a quick person. She was a person who examined things from multiple angles before committing to them, who ran the numbers, who looked for the risk. But she was also, underneath all of that, a person who had always known what she wanted when she finally let herself see it, and what she saw in Marcus Devereux was something she had not known she was still looking for. He was steady, not in the boring way, not in the flattened, predictable way of a person without interior life, but in the way of a tree that has grown through difficult seasons and is rooted because of them, not in spite of them. He had raised 3 children with patience and humor and a kind of unshowy devotion that asked for nothing in return and gave everything anyway. He had lost his marriage and his best friend and several versions of himself that he had once thought were permanent, and he had not become bitter about any of it. He had become, instead, someone who knew the value of a good evening and a warm room and a person worth talking to. He saw her too. Not the version of her that the world saw. The wheelchair, the money, the history, the loss. But the person underneath all of those things. The person who still got angry about injustice and laughed too loudly at her own jokes and cried at documentaries about animals and had opinions about architecture and missed running with a grief that never fully went away. He saw that person and he was interested in her. Genuinely, specifically, without agenda, and Margaret, who had spent 2 years feeling like a problem that people were trying to manage, felt something shift permanently in the way she understood herself. She was not broken. She had never been broken. She had been changed, which was different, and the difference mattered. 8 months after the night at the Millbrook Cultural Center, on a Saturday morning in winter when the snow was coming down in the heavy, serious way of a Wisconsin January, Marcus arrived at her building with coffee and sat across from her at the small table by the window and said, without preamble, that he was in love with her. Margaret looked at the snow for a moment. Then she looked at him. "I know," she said. "I've known for a while." "And," he said. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, the coffee was warm and the room was quiet, and Margaret Whitfield, who had lost so much and rebuilt so carefully and arrived at this small city in Wisconsin looking for something she couldn't name, looked at the man sitting across from her and understood that the thing she had been looking for had walked across a dance floor and asked a simple question and waited, without any impatience at all, for her to be ready to answer. "And I'm in love with you too," she said. It was not the end of anything hard. Life does not work that way. There were still difficult days and complicated logistics, and a world that was not always built for the two of them together. There were his children and her past, and the 1,000 practical and emotional negotiations of 2 full-grown people choosing each other in the second half of their lives. None of that disappeared. But on that snowy Saturday morning, none of it was the most important thing. The most important thing was 2 people sitting by a window with warm coffee, telling each other the truth, in the quiet and unhurried way of people who have finally found something worth staying still for.